Welcome to Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Good afternoon, Ray.
Hello, Keith. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I was telling you earlier today when I talked to you that I saw a picture of you standing in front of a big rocket yesterday. Tell us about that.
Yes, I got invited to come down to Huntsville, Alabama, and to do a presentation on the history of Oak Ridge, of course. And so I went down there, and I had to do it at 3 in the afternoon. And there were 75 people that attended it, so it was an excellent opportunity. But I went down about 3 hours early and went through the Space and Rocket Center there in Huntsville. Really enjoyed it. You know, they've got one ride there that's called G-Force, and they
Mhm.
put you in this round contraption. They lean you up against the wall, and then they spin you at 45 miles an hour, which will put 3 Gs on your body. Now, what they don't tell you, and I probably oughtn't to let this out of the bag, but I'm going to. What they don't tell you is when they get you up to speed and you're standing there just with a seatbelt around you, just sort of standing there, and you can feel that you're being pushed back against the wall. But all of a sudden, they drop the floor out from under you. So your feet's not touching anything.
Wow.
You're just being pinned up against that wall.
I think I rode that ride at a fair once.
It may be, I don't know. But
Back when
then
I,
I went over and had my picture made in front of that huge,
yeah,
what is it, the Saturn
Saturn,
V rocket,
Saturn
I
V.
believe. That's
Right.
the biggest rocket I have ever seen. Then I wanted my picture made by it.
All right. Well, good. Well, why don't you introduce our guest today, Ray?
I'll be happy to. Michelle Shocklee is with us today. Michelle contacted me, I don't remember, some time ago, and asked me a question about Oak Ridge because she was doing some research on a possible book for Oak Ridge, and she wanted to talk about K-25. So we did that, and in the course of the conversation, I asked her about other books that she had written, and she suggested that one that she had, and I'll hold it up here. It's called All We Thought We Knew. And I said, well, let me look at that. And it's about Tullahoma.
Hmm.
And I thought, oh my goodness, that's close enough to Oak Ridge. Let's see what we can do with that. So I asked her if she wouldn't mind to come and be on our program and let us talk about what she's written in this book, All We Thought We Knew. Now, Michelle, if you don't mind, I love that picture of the lady looking over her shoulder.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, I write novels for Tyndale House Publishers, and so I don't have a lot of say in the covers, but they do send me a couple of different choices.
Options,
And
yeah.
yes, so this one just really drew me in. Her red coat just really pops out. I've got a copy of my book too.
Mhm.
And they did put a red spine on it and a lot of blue and white. And because it's set in World War II and the Vietnam War, I think the red, white, and blue
I
just
do.
is so perfect for this book. So I really, really love the details that the cover artist put into this book.
I agree. It all matches the story really well, and there's
Mhm.
a good choice of colors. Well, tell us about what you can go anywhere you want to now, because I know
Okay.
this is not the only book you've written, but
No.
I do want us to focus on it a bit. But tell us about yourself, what you're about.
Okay. Well, my husband and I, my husband of 37 years, we work as estate caretakers. And so he's a Texan. So we lived in Texas for the first 30 years of our marriage. And when the job we were doing there, taking care of a 400-acre ranch, when that job ended, we decided to just break out of Texas and do something different. And a job opened up outside of Nashville to take care of a 250-acre farm, gorgeous, beautiful farm. And so we've been here for 7 years this month, and we absolutely love what we do. But I had never actually stepped a toe in Tennessee before we came for the interview. I'm from Santa Fe, New Mexico, grew up in the west part of the country. I know all about the west part, but I didn't know a lot about, the eastern side of the Mississippi. So I have just been like a sponge soaking up Tennessee's history since we moved here. And as a writer of historical fiction, I knew that I would definitely want to incorporate my new state into a lot of books. So All We Thought We Knew is actually my fourth Tennessee book. I have Under the Tulip Tree, which is right there, Count the Nights by Stars, and Appalachian Song, which is actually not far from Oak Ridge. It's set outside of Gatlinburg at the Walker Sisters cabin.
Yeah.
So I really have loved digging into the history of Tennessee.
So how long have you been writing historical fiction?
I have been writing for probably 20 years, but not publishing
Okay.
until 2017. It was a long journey of learning to write. I was a stay-at-home mom with two boys, raising two boys, so there wasn't a lot of time to write.
Sure.
So, the journey might have taken some time, but it was the perfect. I wouldn't go back and change anything. So my first novel was published in 2017.
Okay.
Excellent. But before we go and focus on the one that we want to feature today, talk a little bit about Appalachian Song.
Appalachian Song came out last year, and when my husband and I went to the Great Smoky Mountains the first time to just explore, because I'm a Rocky Mountain girl, so the Smoky Mountains, I wanted to see what the big pull was, because, could it really live up to my Rocky Mountains? And I'm pleased to say that they do. They're gorgeous. I love the Great Smoky Mountains. And so we've spent a lot of time there, and there is a cabin outside of Gatlinburg that was owned by the Walker family. They lived there since the early mid 1800s, I'd say. Yeah. And the Walker sisters, there were 7 sisters, but only one married. And the other 6 lived in this cabin for their entire lives. When the national park was gathering up land in that area, the Walker sisters didn't want to sell. They held out for a long time. But about the time their cabin was going to be annexed, their property was going to be annexed by the government, they sold it, but with the stipulation that they could stay in it for the rest of their lives. And so now that cabin is there. It's, empty. Nobody lives in it anymore, but it's such a great little hike to go see it. And the minute I turned the corner and saw this old rustic cabin and the history behind it, I knew I wanted to set a story there. So Appalachian Song is not the Walker sisters story, but it's very much inspired by them. There's a group of older sisters, and a young woman shows up on their doorstep, and she's pregnant. And the theme in the book is I Choose You, with adoption at the heart of the story. And so I'm very pleased to say that I just learned last week that it is up for an award, the Christie Award, which is a pretty prestigious award in Christian fiction. So I'm excited about that.
Well, that is good. And I love that setting as well. Obviously, I've been in the Smoky Mountains, and I've been in the Rocky Mountains, and I like the Smokies better. But the Walker cabin is it's just tremendous. The story that is inspiring, and thank you for telling us a little about it. Keith, you were gonna say something.
I was going to ask, when you write these this is fiction, obviously, but it's historical fiction, because you've got real places and real times. How do you merge those two effectively?
Well, I call myself a purist when it comes to historical facts. All of my books, I take the little nuggets like the Walker sisters cabin and just really dig into the history of it. I want to know very much the details of their lives, the people that I'm studying and researching, who I'm going to use as inspiration. I don't ever really want to write about a real person, because that was their life, but I will fictionalize their life if, if it turns out that way. And so I really spend a lot of time on research. I probably spend, a couple of months before I even start writing, and then research all the way through the writing process, which takes almost a year. So I'm always gathering little details. In my novel, Count the Nights by Stars, it's set in Nashville during the 1897 Tennessee Centennial Exposition. And so I know the Parthenon, we all know about the Nashville Parthenon, was part of that. And that's the only building that remains, but there were 200 other buildings. And so I had to really dig into resources that showed pictures, that showed details. I had a lot of real dry details about measurements and pricing of food and things. But when you put that in a book, a novel attached to a real character who's going through visiting the Centennial Exposition or something, they come to life. Those dry facts come to life. And so that's what I desperately try with every book that I write.
I just find that interesting. I'm a documentary filmmaker, historical documentary filmmaker, and
Oh,
that's
uh-huh.
what I've done for my whole career. And so you're absolutely right. I always say that my first priority is historical accuracy.
Yes.
I just whether it's something that people are not going to be are not familiar with or they don't like, it doesn't matter. It's it's our history. We need to tell the history as it is with as much accuracy as possible. And most of well, all of my films, I get most of the research from the people who lived it. So I'm fortunate enough to be able to have done that, just like Ray does with with all of his work. So I was just curious about the merging of fact and fiction and how that
Mhm.
came to be.
Again, and as she was, and we'll talk about this a little later, but as she was researching a book that she's working on now, I was able to tell her about K-25, and I know that she used oral histories.
Okay.
Keith, we have what? You don't know this, Michelle, but Keith has done what?
It's
Over
between
how many hundred?
it's between 400 and 500 for the Center for Oak Ridge
Wow.
Oral History.
So probably what you were watching were one of the oral histories Keith created. Some other people have done, but he done it as well. But Keith has done the majority of what we have there now. So
Well,
uh,
they were fantastic. I found them so helpful, so fascinating. So thank you for doing that.
Sure, absolutely.
all right, let's go to Tullahoma and let's talk
Okay.
about all we thought we knew. Tell us that story.
Okay, so in my process of learning Tennessee's history, I knew that I wanted to set a book in Tennessee during World War II's home front. And so I started to kind of dig around about what was happening in Tennessee during World War II. And I hadn't landed on Oak Ridge just yet. But I did land on Tullahoma. And the reason why Tullahoma was important was because there was a military installation there called Camp Forest. And the fascinating thing about that camp that drew me to write a book about it was they housed German POWs and German enemy aliens there throughout the war. And so, as a history nerd, I kind of call myself, I knew about Japanese enemy aliens being interned throughout the whole war, but I didn't really realize that Germans and Italians were as well. I probably should have known that, but I didn't. And so I started to really dig into that topic of German enemy aliens. And so I created a character who was a German medical student in New York. And the book kind of follows his journey of being arrested or detained, is what they called it, being shipped to Tennessee. He meets a young woman who's on the cover. That's Ava on the cover of the book. And she works at Camp Forest in the hospital. And so their story, it revolves around everything that was actually going on at Camp Forest and in Tennessee and with German enemy aliens throughout the country. And then the other story, because I write time slip stories, the other story is set during the Vietnam War in Tullahoma as well. So I have the two wars, people experiencing the home front, what was going on in the home front during both of those wars. And so I just had a really great time, fascinating time, just researching all that was going on in Tullahoma during those days.
You know,
So
it,
I'm
oh,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
Oh, I
No,
was just going to say, is when you're talking about that, it reminds me of a story that I heard years ago, and I actually contemplated making a documentary about it, but I didn't, like so many things. But there were several in Tennessee. There were several German prisoner of war camps,
Oh,
and
okay.
one of those was down in Tellico Plains, Tennessee. And Tellico Plains was the home of the canning manufacturer Stokely. which became Stokely Van Camp. And
Oh.
the Germans taught, and Stokely had a huge contract for rations for the government, but the Germans worked in the fields. The German prisoners worked in the fields for the canning facility, and the Germans taught them how to make sauerkraut. And
Oh,
that's how
wow.
Stokely Van Camp began to can and sell sauerkraut. So anyway,
Wow,
Oh, just a
that's a
little,
neat little tidbit.
it's a little
little bit of little known history of how we got
Mhm.
sauerkraut.
that's true.
Now, let me Keith, as you mentioned, there were more than just Camp Forest. There were
Yeah.
others. Is the one that you mentioned, Tellico Plains? Now, there's also was one in Crossville.
In Crossville, yes.
Yeah. So I know, and there probably were others, but we know of at least those three.
Mhm.
So well, I want to ask this first before we delve into the details of the German of Camp Forest. How did you tie the Vietnam War and World War II together?
Through the characters.
Right.
The woman who's on the cover, Ava, she's in the 1940s story, and she's also in the 1960s story with a family. And so the families and I mean the characters are always connected in some point in a time slip story.
So you do that with all your books, time slip stories?
The last four of my novels have been time slip, and my publisher enjoys that. So
Sure.
that's what I'll keep writing until they not tell me not to.
Right. I understand.
Oh, that's right. Whatever's selling, write it.
That's exactly right.
All right. Well, what more can you share about especially the World War II
Mhm.
atmosphere that was in Camp Forest?
Well, Camp Forest was a really important military installation. It was one of the largest in the United States. And so hundreds of thousands and thousands of soldiers passed through there. And so I thought that was a real neat detail to kind of touch on, even though I don't really have a soldier in the book. But the hospital there in Camp Forest, it was also used throughout the entire war. Once the English people, the English hospitals were too full. Once the Americans started becoming wounded and using the hospitals in England, they had to go somewhere. So they started to come back to the United States, and Camp Forest had a 2,000 bed hospital that was pretty much full the entire war.
Wow.
And so that was, since that was such a big part of Camp Forest, I wanted to have some characters work there. So Ava she's not a nurse, but she works for a doctor who's in charge of the hospital. And so that was how she met Gunther, who is our German enemy alien, because even though they were detained, the enemy aliens were detained, they weren't necessarily under arrest. So they could get jobs on the Camp Forest if they wanted to. They, like you said, they were also actually used in the community. They farmers hired them to come and plow their fields and gather crops. And so I just thought that was really interesting because it was a part of the enemy alien story that I didn't know. So, but unfortunately, there's nothing to see of Camp Forest anymore. As soon as the war was over in 1946, they decommissioned it and pretty much tore it down and used all the materials as surplus and sold it. So when you go out there, there's roads that don't go anywhere, railroad tracks that don't go anywhere. And Arnold Engineering is now occupying the land. So, and Tullahoma is a very cute little town. Before the war, it was only about 4,500 people. And then during the war, when Camp Forest grew from a 1,500 acre National Guard installation to an 85,000 acre military installation, the town grew to about 75 to 80,000 people too. So it went through a lot of changes, just as I'm sure Oak Ridge did as well.
Yes, that's for sure. That was tremendous change in Oak Ridge. It went from a farming community to a city of 75,000 people in less than 3 years. So tremendous change taking place for sure.
Mhm.
Now, these Germans that were there, they were not locked up, right? They could move about in the community. How'd they keep track of it?
Well, they weren't exactly free.
Okay.
If they took a job, then they were usually escorted to it and then escorted back to the area in Camp Forest where they lived, and it was fenced off.
Yeah.
So they couldn't just go as they wanted to, but if they got permission to, if they were, became trusted, then they could go into the community. They were driven into the community and then driven back when their job was finished. But they were never really arrested. They had a hearing when they were first detained, and if the government felt that they were dangerous people who couldn't be out on the streets, then they had to go to these camps that were all over the United States. I said I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there had been an internment camp there for the Japanese people. And I think that's probably why I just kind of associated internment camps with Japanese Americans or Japanese people who had ties to Japan. But I was just really interested in the whole German aspect, mainly because I have a lot of German history and ancestry in my family. So it was interesting.
That was a good connection then.
Yeah, it was.
So how did you get his last name, Schneider?
It's probably one of the family names in my heritage that goes way back. I get a lot of my names from ancestry, my family tree that I've traced back to like the 1500s. So I try to use a lot of family names.
Can you imagine? My last name is Smith. I can go back to 1850. That's if I can't get any further than that.
Really? Because it's so common.
Yeah, it's so common. There's so many Smiths. I give up.
Yeah.
Oh, so you use your ancestry to get some of the information. How did you gain other information about the Germans in Tullahoma?
Well, there is a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Taylor who a few years ago, I can't remember her story exactly why she latched on to Camp Forest, but she did. So she wrote a couple of different research books that I actually have, at least one of them here.
Okay.
She has just really dug into the history of Camp Forest the way that nobody else had up until that point. And she's been real instrumental. She has set up a foundation, Camp Forest Foundation. She's been real involved in creating a museum there in Tullahoma, a very small museum at this point, of a lot of the artifacts from Camp Forest. And I'm not sure how she got them all, but she has artwork that a lot of the POWs, the German POWs did at the time. She's got a lot of memorabilia. So she's doing a lot of work to bring Camp Forest to life for us who don't know anything about it.
Now,
So I've got her two books, and they were just invaluable to my research.
now, did she have a personal connection to Camp Forest, or is this just something she was interested in because she was from the area?
I don't believe she has a personal connection to it. I could be wrong, but unfortunately, I don't remember.
That's all right.
Oh man. Well, you can't be too thankful for those kind of research finds when you find somebody's done a lot of good research for you and put it in a book, then that helps you, I'm sure.
Yes. Yes, that's the lifeblood of my books.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Vietnam era a little bit. Tell us about what was going on there.
So the characters in the book it's a family, the Taylor family, and they live on a horse farm outside of Tullahoma. So in both stories, the World War II story and the Vietnam story, this farm is where everybody gathers. And Maddie, the young woman in the 1969 story, is the twin sister of Mark, who dies in Vietnam. And that's how the book starts. We all know that Mark died in Vietnam. And she's angry. She's a young woman who's very passionate about what she feels, and she feels Vietnam is very wrong, like a lot of Americans did at the time. They didn't believe that America should have sent troops to Vietnam. And so she's very passionate about it. And she and her father really clash over this whole Vietnam issue, the way families did back then. So I wanted to bring out both sides of the Vietnam issue. And so I have a wounded warrior, Nash, who's back from the war. He and Mark had been best friends. And so there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of feelings, very strong feelings going on in all of these characters because, you know, war is a terrible thing, but unfortunately it's a necessary thing sometimes. We couldn't not go into World War II. And even though Vietnam is still very much debated, a lot of people believe that, yes, we should have been there. And a lot of people believe that, no, we shouldn't have. So I wanted to bring out those feelings through these characters.
I'm a Vietnam veteran.
Oh, well, thank you for your service.
Thank you. I have to quickly tell this story. Keith's heard it, but just be patient, Keith. My wife had Fanny for 57 years. She passed away a couple of years ago with COVID and sarcoidosis. But at any rate, after we retired, she worked at Oak Ridge Associated Universities for 35 years there in Oak Ridge, and I was working at Y12. When we retired, we began to travel. We traveled a lot. We went to Europe. Of all of the Europe, well, we went to Brazil, we went to Alaska. But anyway, in Europe, we loved the Viking River cruises. I mean, they put you on a river and they'll drop you off and let you see a city, and then you get back on the same boat and sleep that night while they're moving to another city. So it's really good. We were in Paris and they took us off and put us on buses, and they took us up to Normandy, to the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach. And when they got there, they asked for a veteran to lay a wreath at the bottom of that monument, a man coming up out of the water. So I volunteered, laid the wreath there. And then they said, any other veteran in the audience, come up and let us recognize you too. About 20 other people came up. They said, thank you for your service, all the things they normally do. When they got through, the man standing beside me just turned to me and said, welcome home. Now, that's a dead giveaway. He's a Vietnam vet. We didn't get welcomed home. I didn't wear my uniform when I came. So I turned to him and I said, when were you in country? He said 1968 and 69. Now, that's when I was there, from November 68 to November 69. And then when he said that, two other men standing very near us at the same time said, I was there in 68 and 69. So you got 4 Vietnam vets standing there. We didn't talk. We just looked at one another a minute. And Fanny's over to the side, not knowing what's going on, but she's making pictures. And when we got back to the ship that night, she was looking at her pictures, and she had made a picture of the 4 of us standing there under that statue. That's the highlight of all of my European travels, just a few seconds with 4 Vietnam veterans standing under that statue.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of stories about Vietnam.
I'm sure. And I did want to be sure that in the book, I did touch on that, about that not all soldiers were welcome home from Vietnam, which is just such a shame. It's just such a sad part of that history, because it wasn't the soldiers' fault that we started a war or we went to war. So thank you. Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. And let's put a wrap on this particular part of the of your story. Is there anything you want to tell us without giving away the ending of the stories? Is there anything else you'd like for us to know about All We Thought We Knew?
Well, it's just a story of discovery, a lot of family issues. Yes, there's the wars going on, but there's a lot of issues going on with the family as well. They've got to work through it. Maddie is just a mess. And we hope that she's not a mess by the end of the book. And
There
so
you go.
there's just a lot of issues that a lot of people go through even today without wars going on, a lot of family issues. There is an illness, a very strong illness happening that people are having to work through. So I think it's a book that a lot of people can relate to in a lot of different ways.
Let me ask you a question. You mentioned earlier that one of your books was up for a Christie Award, which is I guess a faith-based
Mhm.
award. Are all of your do all of your books incorporate that
Mhm.
element of Christian or faith-based story?
They do.
Okay.
I am a Christian who writes fiction, but I also write for a publisher who publishes Christian fiction.
All right.
So I feel like all my stories, I want to put hope in that. And because I am a Christian, I feel like there's only one source for true hope.
Mhm.
So one thing I definitely don't want to do in any of my novels, though, is to, I guess you'd call it a Bible thumper or beat people over the head with scripture. I don't ever do that because that wasn't my journey. My
Mhm.
journey in faith is like a lot of people, it's very subtle. It's a very steady growth. And that's what I want to portray in my characters' lives.
It's interesting. I was watching an interview the other day with Nate Bargatze, the comedian Nate Bargatze, who's from Mount Juliet, or from Old Hickory. He's from Old Hickory, and he's really just blown up the last couple of years. And they
Mm,
were asking him about he lived in New York for 8 or 9 years when he first started out becoming a comedian, but he's always been clean. He's never been racy. All of his comedy has always been clean. And they asked him about that, and he says, you know, I'm from the South. I'm a Christian. That's just who I am. You know,
yeah.
and he said, that's just, I never saw that. That just wasn't, I never even thought of it. Never even thought of doing anything other than who I am. So
Right.
I think there's a whole lot of value in an artist creating art that comes from a deep place within themselves,
Mhm.
that is you stay true to yourself and to your own values when you do that.
For sure. I think that's true. I think that's definitely true.
So you talk about people identifying with the stories, and they can. I mean, I'm a Vietnam vet, so anything written about Vietnam, I can generally identify with. And while I tend to not watch movies about Vietnam, I just don't need that. I
Mhm.
do find interest in people who've written seriously about uh, the conflict, and I've also had well, I had the difficulty of dealing with a chronic illness. Fanny had sarcoidosis, and she was on prednisone for 25 years. Now, if you didn't know she was sick, just by looking at her, she always kept herself, well, and she would participate and do things that any normal person would do. So you wouldn't know she was sick, but I did. And
Mhm.
between the two of us, we communicated deeply about what her condition was, and how to best keep her in the mainstream of the activities. I was an elder at the church, and I was a historian in the city, still am. And she was involved in those things as well. But unless you've had a situation where you've had to deal with chronic illness for years, you don't understand it. But when you see something written about it, you can immediately identify whether they know what they're talking about or not. It's so
Mhm.
obvious. So I'm glad to see that in your book. I think it is well done. I do.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mhm. So we've talked enough about all we thought we knew. What's coming up on the horizon for you? What do you plan to do next? Or what are you already working on?
Definitely already working on it.
Mhm.
Um, as my publisher and I discuss what would be the next book that I should write, I threw out this idea about this little town that not a lot of people have heard about, the history, and that would be Oak Ridge. Um,
Yeah.
as I said, I didn't know a lot about Tennessee history. And so 2 summers ago, well, I guess it was actually in the fall, but 2 years ago, I was doing a book signing in a small town called Butler, Tennessee, way on the North Carolina border. And a woman came up to me and she was just excited to get my book, but she blurted out that her mother had worked at Oak Ridge. I'm sure I had a very blank look on my face. I said, "Oh, that's nice." I did not know. You know, the Oak Ridge Boys, as we were talking earlier, the Oak Ridge Boys is about all I knew about Oak Ridge. And so I immediately went home, being the history lover that I am, and started to investigate why this woman would tell me her mother worked at Oak Ridge. And I was flabbergasted that I had never heard of Oak Ridge. Now, I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Exactly.
I know all about Santa
Both of
Fe.
them.
I
And
know all about the Trinity bomb. My grandparents lived 50 miles from where the Trinity bomb was exploded. I know all about that, but I had never heard of Oak Ridge, or if I had heard of it, it didn't stick.
Yeah.
And so I was just absolutely fascinated. So I am definitely working on a new novel that will come out next year, and it will be set in Oak Ridge.
have you read Denise Kearnan's book, The Girls of Atomic City?
I've read it from cover to cover and marked it up like any good research book is marked up.
She called me when she wanted to write that book and said, "Ray, I want to write a book about the women in Oak Ridge." And I said, "Good, I'll help you. I'll introduce you to them." So I did. I introduced her to one woman, Colleen Black. Colleen took over and she introduced her to all the rest of them. I didn't have to do anything. During the period of research, and she worked on it at least 3 years, she would come, she and her husband Joel would come to Oak Ridge periodically. And as they were interviewing these primarily women, a few men, but Connie Bowling, Keith was one she interviewed. And of course, she loved Ed Westcott, the photographer, and Bill Wilcox, the historian at the time. But among those, one, Virginia Coleman. She was not a Cayetron girl. They didn't call them Cayetron girls back in the day. And you be careful as you're writing.
Yes.
They called them cubicle operators. If you mention anyone at Y12 that was a woman, don't say Cayetron girl.
No.
That didn't happen until 2004, when one of them came back, saw herself in the picture, told the museum director, "That's me in that picture." And he called me and said, "Ray, I found you a Cayetron girl." Well, we started calling them Cayetron girls, and that
Oh,
on,
Yeah.
and now everybody calls them, well, lots of people call them Cayetron girls. That didn't
wow.
mean anything back in the day. But at any rate, Virginia Coleman was a chemist working at Y12. So she and Denise hit it off really well. And what happened is, when Denise and Joe would come to Oak Ridge during at least the last year, maybe even more, they didn't get a hotel. They stayed at Virginia's house, and they developed a really good friendship while they were here working on that book. Of course, Denise is in Asheville, North Carolina, and I'm still in touch with her. She's written several other books since then. She's a really good writer, she and Joe both. But if I have one book to recommend to people who are thinking about women in Oak Ridge, I recommend Denise's book. And of course, when you publish yours, I'll recommend yours.
Thank you. I really, really enjoyed Denise's book. It was fascinating. I loved the way she laid out the history of each of the women.
Yeah, she did. And the history of the personal history of the women is there, but she interspersed the detailed history about what Oak Ridge was really all about, producing that uranium for Little Boy. And she included enough. It's not written at a level that's difficult to understand. It's not written from a scientific viewpoint, but it's accurate. She does a good job describing it using everyday language, which is that's not easy to do. Those of us in Oak Ridge, we don't watch ourselves. We'll talk in acronyms all day. People don't know what we're talking about.
No. And I appreciated that she did that, because for me, I would have gotten lost in all of the scientific stuff.
Yeah, I think
it's interesting that you talk about not knowing anything about Oak Ridge. One of my very first documentary films, and I've done 6 historical documentaries on Oak Ridge. But my first one is called Secret City, the Oak Ridge Story, the War Years. And I made that, and I pitched it, and, you know, was embraced by the community. And they really wanted that story told because there was a sense that every time the History Channel or anybody did anything on World War II, it was always about Los Alamos.
Yeah.
They just felt like Oak Ridge's story had not been told. Yeah. And so that film is, it's, you know, it is about Oak Ridge and what happened, you know, leading up to World War II, and then what happened in Oak Ridge through, you know, through the end of World War II. So it was, and a lot of people liked that, didn't they, Ray?
Oh yeah, we put out a red carpet for you, Keith. It
Yeah,
was
we
a
did.
good deal.
A big
And
premiere.
it's still one of the, well, it is, in my opinion, the best history of Oak Ridge you're going to find is in that Keith made two of them. One is the war years, and the second one, and it's 90 minutes long. The second one is from 1945 to 2006. So you get the full history of Oak Ridge if you look at those two documentary films, and they're out available on YouTube. You can find them easy, and in fact, I have on my card that I hand out to people, I have the link to them on. So every presentation I make, I promote going and watching these.
I suspect that I've probably seen them.
Yeah, you probably have.
Ray, the second film, it deals a lot with, of course, it's the Cold War, you know, years, and K-25 is in the second film, well,
a lot more
because it was so active in that time period as well. So
right, and if you haven't seen that one, I think that 45 to 2006 is a good reference for you for the K-25 information. What's the working title of your book?
Of the Oak Ridge book?
Yeah.
The Secrets We Couldn't Tell is the working title. So
that's good. If your publisher's got any, excuse me, but maybe they won't change your title. I like it.
I hope not. I hope not. We'll know very soon. It's going through the editing process right now, and then probably sometime in January or February, they will put out a cover and a synopsis, and then I'll be able to share a little bit more about it.
Right. Very good. Well, Keith, I can't miss an opportunity to promote the book that we just published, Critical Connections. And oh, by the way, it has a title, Critical Connections, the University of Tennessee and Oak Ridge from the Dawn of the Atomic Age to the Present. Now, you got to know the publisher had a lot to do with that title, Michelle. So
yes.
We were just playing around with words, and they said, here's what your title is. So that's okay. That's what it is. But we've got a couple more sessions coming up. We're going to do one at the library in Oak Ridge on October 16. So that may be the last one that we do of the launching of the book and signing the book signing. So, Michelle, anything else you want to share with us before we leave?
Well, I just really appreciate you inviting me on and letting me talk about my books and talk about history. I love talking about history with people who really love history.
Yeah, well, we do, that's for sure. And I applaud your book that I've read. I think it's a good one. I'm going to order Appalachian Song, and I'll enjoy it as well, because I love the Smokies and the Walker sisters, and that's
good. Thanks.
So.
All right. Well, thank you.
Really glad to have you on. You bet.
Yeah,
thank you guys very much.
We really appreciate it. Ray, who do we have lined up next?
Well, we've got Dick Groves, who is General Groves' grandson. Dick is working on a 13-volume, volume's not the right word, 13-episode documentary of the Manhattan Project. Right. And he's going far deeper in the details than anyone I've ever seen before. An example is, I just learned this a few weeks ago from him. You know that there was a letter prepared by Leo Szilard And he knew that President Roosevelt wouldn't know him, so he got Albert Einstein to sign it. And they prepared the letter, and then they got Alexander Sachs, who was a personal friend of President Roosevelt. They used him to get the letter to him. And this letter is what actually started the Manhattan Project eventually. And what I just learned from Dick is that President Roosevelt never read the letter. Alexander Sachs took the letter and wrote a short 1-paragraph executive summary and put it on top of the letter. And when he gave it to the president, President Roosevelt read the 1-paragraph summary and said, "You're trying to tell me that Germany's making a big bomb and they're going to drop it on us, and we need to get to it first." And Sachs said, "Yes, that's it." He said, "Okay, we'll do it." And that's where he went from there and started what eventually, he had started the uranium committee, and it evolved into the S1 and eventually became the Manhattan Project, all from reading that one little paragraph.
Now, we've had Dick on before.
Yeah, he will tell us where he is now.
Yeah, we want to get an update from him on that because he mentioned that project before, but we want to get an update from him.
Yeah, he's almost got it to the point that within the next few months, or it takes longer than you think, maybe a year or more, but he's getting close. And that reminds me, Michelle, when you publish the book about Oak Ridge, we're going to want you back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I would love to come back.
Well, we will definitely do that. We'll stay in touch, and when it comes out, we'll see if they've changed the title.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. All right. Well, thanks again for being here.
Thank you very much.
All right, folks, thanks for watching, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new Hidden History.